I feel like we have a lot we could talk about. I think our time is going to go really fast. And so if we do go over the 30 minutes we have planned, everyone is fine with that and the future speakers. So we can take the time we need. So first of all, I guess I'd love to hear from you as a psychiatrist, what the types of things we should be thinking about. And this is, advice for people in the Philadelphia area and beyond, dealing with COVID and what's happening with racial issues and, different groups having complex feelings and how we should really be working through these things.
So that's such a tough question, because I can't remember a time that things have ever been this chaotic in the world. So initially, when COVID happened, I was talking to individuals and groups about how to manage our stress in the midst of COVID and all of the uncertainties and all of the questions. And a lot of the things we talked about include, things like radical self-care. So prioritizing ourselves in ways that maybe we hadn't before, possibly because we have more time now. So a lot of the things that will happen later on in the day through your programs, even simple things like mindfulness and meditation. And when I say mindfulness, I don't mean necessarily sitting still and being mindful, but taking a walk and paying attention to the environment around you. So I always tell my kids when we take a walk, let's utilize our five senses. So what can we smell? What can we see? Can we taste anything? What are we hearing? And just simply being present in the moment can certainly be helpful to reduce stress and calm us down. And, of course, trying to add some level of a routine to our day can be helpful. And those are all things that we were just starting to deal with COVID and just starting to get used to what's happening and just starting to try to engage in some level of structure and routine. And then it seems like the world just exploded. And for some people, racism is new. For a lot of people, this has kind of been our existence, but the rest of the world is just finding out about it. And so seeing numerous videos of Black individuals being murdered on camera and experiencing that trauma and reliving some of the trauma of the past. Now we have to deal with what I call two pandemics. We have COVID and now we have racism, and both of those are traumatic. Both of those are incredibly stressful. And so, doing what we were doing with COVID to try to help calm ourselves down multiplied, because especially for people of color, this is a really challenging and stressful time.
Yeah, totally. And in terms of the ways that, I know we've talked about this before, just the complexity of using mindfulness to deal with some of the racial traumas that have been happening, since the beginning of time, really, how there's this sense of, this concept of resilience and how that can feel like blame, but also that some of these tools can be really useful if these things are happening anyways. And wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure, definitely. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that racism can have a pretty significant negative impact on the minds, bodies, and spirits of people of color. And specifically, there's been a lot of evidence looking at Black or African-American individuals and how we respond to racism and stress. And what's been found, actually, there have been studies that show African-Americans can be physiologically 10 years older than their white counterparts simply because of societal and structural racism. So simply because of having to deal with the day-to-day discrimination or the day-to-day microaggressions, this stress and trauma builds. And it's important to recognize that trauma is cumulative. So the trauma that you experienced in elementary school when you were called a racial slur or you were mistreated, that has built upon the trauma you experienced in college and in the workplace. And so this trauma builds, and this leads to toxic stress, and toxic stress can lead to chronic disease. And so as African Americans and people of color, it's important to recognize that these events aren't benign and they can actually be quite dangerous. But the good news is there has been evidence showing that practices like meditation, prayer, mindfulness can help to combat some of the negative effects of it. So realistically, getting rid of racism is not the responsibility of people of color. It's the responsibility of all of America, but even specifically white America, to really address the impact of racism. But while that's happening, people of color are still dealing with the detrimental impact. So while we're waiting for larger systems to change, as individuals, we can begin doing things to try to limit the impact. And, you know, even long-term racism is connected to heart disease and diabetes and obesity, and a lot of the same risk factors that are present for COVID, for having a negative reaction to COVID. And this can all be linked to chronic stress. So a regular practice of mindfulness, even 5 to 10 minutes a day of being present, being in the moment, paying attention to the way your body feels, paying attention to kind of what you're dealing with right now versus worrying about everything else. Even doing that for a few minutes a day can reduce your heart rate, reduce blood pressure, reduce our cortisol and stress hormones, and long-term try to again minimize the threat that racism can be for Black Americans. And, you know, we pray. A lot of Black Americans have religious affiliations that engage in some level of prayer. Prayer is meditation, and prayer is engaging in mindfulness, and simply doing that and incorporating that into our daily lives can really help to reduce the stressful impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful to hear. Do you think that there's so mindfulness often is like focusing attention, and some other types of meditation are more like feeling the feelings you're feeling and getting into them so that they're not so hard to, trying to process them. Do you have a sense of what types of different meditations work for different things?
So that's a great question. I think it's more to do with the individual. It's if people are able to tolerate getting in touch with their emotion. So many people may have had the experience of having a difficult day or having a really negative interaction, and then you come home and you snap on your family, or you find that you're super irritable and you go to bed and you just feel incredibly uptight and frustrated and you're not able to pinpoint why. Mm-hmm. And if you were to engage in a meditation that led you to reflect, even, you know, engaging in journal writing or engaging in gratitude or keeping an appreciation journal, that would allow you to be able to connect these negative emotions and the frustration to that experience that may have happened 7 hours prior, but clearly still left an impact on you and it's affecting you. And so if you're able to engage in a practice of self-reflection, that will just, you know, allow you to see more of what's happening around you and what's happening to you, and mm-hmm. being able to make those connections. But if remembering that or doing that is too painful or too difficult, even simply engaging in a practice of deep breathing, that alone is enough. It's called the relaxation response, where just deep breathing has been directly connected to decreasing cardiovascular risks. And so even that alone can be helpful. But if you're able to have that reflective opportunity, you know, ideally that would be great, but some people, it just may be too painful to do that. So it's really based on what you're comfortable with. And then there are even other practices that may not be as mainstream. So my kids love laughter yoga. And it sounds very silly, but it's literally a practice of doing different laughter exercises, and it involves stretching and laughing and deep breathing, because my kids can't sit still. So trying to do a meditation with them would not work. So we do laughter yoga, and they love it, and they're able to be in the moment, and we're laughing and we're moving and we're deep breathing, and afterwards they feel better. And it also is, you know, a way to kind of get out some of that frustration. So we'll even do that if we've had a bad day. All right, before we go to bed, let's do a laughter yoga exercise. And it's amazing how it impacts them and how much they love it.
Awesome. I would love to see that sometime. Let's see, I have a lot of other questions for you. So you do some unbiasing work, and I'm just wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that, because that is an area of expertise for you.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been getting a lot of questions and calls recently because, again, racism and implicit and explicit bias has been a big topic of conversation lately. I think one important topic or one important statement to make is that there is no getting rid of racism in 1 2-hour talk. Like, there's no reading one book and suddenly I'm anti-racist. Like, I think people are under the impression if they just do X or if they just do this, then suddenly that makes them anti-racist. And I really want to emphasize that it's taken time to build a lot of the stereotypes and biases that we have. So it's going to take a lot of time and effort to get rid of those biases and do unbiasing work. And so, in terms of connection to mindfulness and meditation, again, there is evidence showing that individuals who engage in a regular practice of mindfulness are less likely to stereotype and are less likely to rely on implicit biases. So, essentially implicit biases are shortcuts that our brains take so that we don't have to deal with the individual details, or these are like stereotypes that we fall back on. So assuming that an African-American person is more aggressive without having any evidence, or assuming that, a Latino person doesn't speak English. And so we end up falling back on these often harmful stereotypes. But if we actually took the time to individuate and get to know each person as an individual rather than clumping them in with a larger group, or again, being self-reflective. And if you do make that mistake of stereotyping someone, having enough insight to take a step back and say, wait a minute, I know nothing about this person. There's no evidence to show me that this person is aggressive. Why would I think that? And so starting to question yourself. So in terms of actually becoming anti-racist or doing the unbiasing work, the first step is just acknowledgement that we all have biases. They exist. To say I don't see color is just not true. And the fact that's a type of microaggression to say like, I don't see color in people, because that's, again, evidence has shown that everybody sees color. But by denying that you see color, you're implicitly going to end up making stereotypes, because you're going to not accept the fact that the color actually exists. So, being self-reflective, understanding that everyone has bias, looking at your own bias. So, there's an implicit association test that is online, that's free, that's the kind of the gold standard. It's not perfect, but it's one way of actually being able to assess our own biases. And then once you've done that, really being reflective about the times that you may have been the aggressor, or that you may have stereotyped someone. And also as an ally, being willing to be uncomfortable. And again, if you are able to be self-reflective, you can accept that discomfort and work through it, versus becoming defensive, which is often what people end up doing when they become uncomfortable. But if you're able to accept that discomfort and sit with it and grow and learn from it, that can be helpful for you as an individual, but then also for the people around you, because you can kind of step up and support other people of color when they're experiencing microaggressions or biases from other people.
Right. And I think even if someone was able to tell themselves they don't see color, which isn't true, but even if they believe that, saying that is dismissive of an entire experience of oppression and inequity that's been happening for hundreds of years. So
exactly.
So let's see. So I think, I guess learning the terminology too. So in case you view it happening to somebody else, you can stand up and say like, the reason why this is not okay is this, and having it not be, the person of color having to do all the education. I think that's really important now. Is like, okay, everyone wants an education. Let's all try to do it without making the labor be all people of color, explaining why this has been a problem forever.
Right. And that's very helpful. Again, a part of being anti-racist is actually being anti-racist. So doing the work. And if a Black individual were to address every time they experienced a microaggression, nothing would ever get done. Like it would just be too exhausting to do. But if you have allies or coworkers or friends who have educated themselves about what a microaggression is or what implicit bias looks like, they've done that work and they've done the self-reflection, then they can identify it and they can address it in the moment or call it out. That's a huge relief. I've had many occasions when things have happened or, been in situations where someone will say, oh, Nicole, you're Black, you do this work. And, you know, and I've had people say, well, actually, why would Nicole be the person to do that work? Or in situations where I've offered a suggestion and it's dismissed, but then a white individual would repeat the same suggestion, and the response is, oh, that's a great idea.
Right.
And, you know, in the moment it feels very invalidating, but I've also had experiences where I've had allies say, actually, Nicole just made that statement and you ignored it. I wonder why that is. And that was hugely relieving for me, and also very validating that I'm not the only person that saw that.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the dangers of microaggressions is that there's like this ambiguity, and people can kind of get out of it like, oh, you're too sensitive about race, or, oh, you're overreacting. But as an ally, if you're able to label it and name it, that's hugely helpful. And oftentimes white individuals will listen to other white individuals before listening to people of color.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. And defaulting to like, let's try and figure out what is correct about this statement, not what's wrong, right?
Yeah. And, you know, just also, I think it's helpful when we use I statements, or where, you know, they, you know, I felt a little uncomfortable when you said that, or I was wondering if your intention was this, because that felt like this way to me, or that felt very hurtful to me. And so if you're making it more personal, then it feels less judgmental, and sometimes people are more willing to receive the feedback.
Yeah, totally. That's really helpful. And I also, I guess, going along with some of these questions, I know you have stated, you know, on social media a few times, just the concern that the white allies jumping on the Black Lives Matter now who are new to the whole idea. And I'm also a little concerned that there's a sense that it's, you know, to really get to the root of the problem, everyone has to find the bias in themselves and address that. And also there's police violence, and that's terrible, but it's not just like, I'm a good person and they're the bad ones and they're the ones we're fighting, because we're actually fighting this entire system that's oppressing.
Right.
And just wondering how, like, do you foresee, I mean, I think there's like a lot of adrenaline also that happens at protests, and it's like, I'm doing a thing. So that's how I felt when I did the Trump protests. I was like, I'm doing this thing. I protested, and I got home, and like somehow I felt like I did a lot, and like didn't probably do enough. But just bridging from like this adrenaline, like we're fighting the cops and they're here, and like they're out in West Philly, they were dropping like tear gas right outside our house there were no protesters. They were just dropping it I think for fear. And like, how do we bridge from this, which is like a lot of fear and a lot of adrenaline and a lot of like grief, to sadness, confusion, to, okay, like I am participating in this system. Right. You know, it's not just about a few unbiasing trainings, but it's really about who am I and what am I doing and who do I think I am and what are these subtle ways in which I play into it.
That's a great question. And I think a lot of it is ongoing reflection. So ongoing practices of mindfulness and meditation, but also kind of admitting that the United States was built on the premise of white supremacy. It was, you know, built on the understanding that, or the belief that certain people were less than others. Mm-hmm. And so our entire society and our institutions were all built based on that understanding. And so to assume that you can do a cultural competency training and suddenly be ready to fight racism just isn't true, because I mean, just about any structure or institution that we engage in has some form of racism embedded in that structure. And so understanding that fighting racism, it's an individual work, it's an individual job that we'll all have to do, and that's difficult. So starting with reading, like the New York Times bestseller list last week when they produced the list, I've never seen all of these books about racism, and it's great and it's encouraging, because I'm hoping that people are actually reading the books and utilizing that information. But so recognizing that it is a part of you and that you have to fight it, but also working within the institutions that you live in and that you work in, because it has to start from both the bottom up and the top down. If we're not investing time and money and resources and leadership into changing how our systems operate, the protests are great and they've been effective at doing a number of things, but it won't be enough. And so to really affect change, I'm hoping that one, people will continue to do the individual work, but they will walk into their places of work and they'll walk into their children's schools, look at the environment. There's no pictures of people of color. There are no books with children of color. There's nothing in this environment that reflects positively on people of color. So even basic things like that, changing the physical environment. There are no teachers of color in our school. There's no, the history of slavery is 3 pages in our history book. And we learn about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And Black history is much more vast than that. And so every single, like medicine, education, corporate America, there are all a variety of different things we can do to try to dismantle racism. And so if we really want to impact change, it's doing on an individual level, an institutional level, and a societal level, and being willing to commit to all of that.
Yeah, definitely. Even in, like, as therapists, we're both psychotherapists, and just the way we diagnose disease is, biased towards certain groups to even qualify, like PTSD, microaggressions build up and cause all this stress, but don't qualify you for treatment for PTSD because they're not, that you're supposed to have one index trauma, one big trauma to call it PTSD. And that's really frustrating because there's so many other forms of PTSD that affect different groups differently.
Yeah, and racism is a form of trauma. Right.
Totally. Well, I think that I had one last question, in fact, and then we'll move on to Cindy, who's here too. So I guess I'm curious about this experience we had on social media, in which we posted an article about inequity during COVID that was disproportionately affecting Black Americans. And in these physician groups, we had a million comments within hours, 300 comments within 3 or 4 hours, people that were like, this is good, and other people that were like, this is racist against white people. And it was like this flurry of craziness. And both of us stayed up all night responding to these posts saying no, this isn't actually racist against white people, because this is actually just disproportionately affecting certain groups, and that's not fair. And then we woke up in the morning and the entire post had been removed. And after looking into what happened, the admins and moderators said that there was just too many racist comments to keep up with, and these were physicians, which is extremely disappointing. And it sort of has gotten me thinking about how the power that these social media groups have to erase narratives, entire narratives of people, and the time they put in to explain. And I think each time we'd repost it and it would get taken down and then reposted, it's like the dominant voices were all more on the racist side. And so we all just gave up trying to explain. But you said to me that's happened a lot. And I think it speaks to what you said, that people feel uncomfortable and then they're like, I just want a comfortable chat room, delete, not think about the implications of what does this mean on a larger scale if all these mini chat rooms are just erasing whole conversations about race.
And it's so interesting because people will say, there's a Facebook group for COVID, there's a Facebook cooking group, and there's a Facebook group on finances, and people want to feel safe in those spaces, and they want those spaces to be dedicated to those specific topics. And when the issue of racism comes up, people will say well, this is no longer my safe space, and this is not, I don't feel comfortable with this, and so that's why this has to be taken down, because this should be dedicated to this one topic.
Or this has nothing to do with medicine.
Right, exactly. Or it has racism has nothing to do with finances. Right. Racism has nothing to do with gardening, when that is the case for people who have never experienced racism. And the difficulty is people of color don't often have a safe space, and we're made to feel uncomfortable in almost any space that we're in that's not specifically dedicated to us. And so when the majority or certain groups experience that discomfort, they immediately push it out because they're not interested in hearing about it. They're not interested in experiencing it. And because they can compartmentalize racism. Well, racism is a topic that belongs over there. And so I don't have to be reflective about it because I don't have to live it. And so that's very easy for people to kind of push that out. But as a, a sexual or gender minority or a person of color, you can't make that choice. Like there's no, this ism is not something I have to deal with, or this bias is not something I have to deal with. It's something that I have to experience every day. And that also kind of just lets you know a lot of people are not ready to do this work, because it is difficult, and it does require a level of, looking at yourself in the mirror and being able to accept what privilege you've had. I always say, people, there's always been discussions around what is white privilege. And for me, one example is, white privilege would be being able to learn about racism rather than living it. And that, alone is a privilege that a lot of people don't have. And that's difficult to hear. And that can be and it doesn't mean that, people haven't earned everything they've gotten and they haven't worked incredibly hard, but just certain things are more difficult for certain individuals in our population. And, in these Facebook groups, people only want to talk about what makes them comfortable, and they only want to talk about the things that they're interested in. And anyone else or anyone else's discomfort is not their problem. And so often, again, minority voices end up being drowned out.
Right, and so I guess there's a lot of things that need to happen to fix that problem, but I guess just as admins or moderators of other groups, maybe realizing that when you erase an entire post, that think about like what your role is in this. Is it just that people are uncomfortable, or is it really inappropriate? Can you take the time to go in and take this super inappropriate racist comments off so that the rest of the narratives can stay on, things like that?
Right. And being okay with centering minority voices.
Yeah.
And being okay with acknowledging that there are people here who are suffering, and that we just have to be able to sit with that and tolerate that so that we can learn.
Right. Totally. Well, thank you, Nicole, for
coming on. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I know there was a question in the chat, and they can certainly email me, so I don't want to take up any more time.
Oh yeah, I think you can answer whatever. Everyone is on a flexible schedule, so I would say if you see a question you want to answer, go for it.
There was just Michelle asked, what am I seeing in children of color during this time? And oh my gosh, there's such a wide variety of responses. I posted on my Twitter, my 5-year-old, who just turned 6 today, I made the mistake of leaving the news on. My husband left the news on, and he saw a video of a Black man being killed by police. And we haven't had that discussion with him around police brutality. And we just introduced the topic of racism. And he was devastated. He was crying. He just learned about community helpers, and police officers are community helpers. And, 6-year-olds are very Black and white. And so seeing a police officer hurt a Black individual just did not make sense to him. And it was a very difficult conversation to have, because then he, well, will he hurt you, mommy? Or will the police come and get daddy? And he was, inconsolable and crying. And there was this intense fear. And this was not a conversation that I was ready to have with my 5-year-old. But what I realized, unfortunately, again, there's no escaping these conversations for children of color. These are conversations that we have to have, and, reflecting and talking to them in a way that they would understand. And so I always tell my son about racism and about bias, that there's certain people who lack understanding, or who lack love in their heart for other individuals. And as a result, they make mistakes, or they do things that hurt other people. And so I think having these conversations is helpful in the same way people say, well, I don't see color, so I don't talk about racism. I always say, well, that's like telling that's like assuming your kid's never going to have sex, so I'm not going to talk about sex ed. They're going to have sex eventually, so it's better if you actually have the discussion in the same way that you have to be willing to talk about racism with children of color and with white children, because at some point they're going to see it, and it's better if we can prepare them for it. And there are so many books for children of color. There's a website called blackbabybooks.com that has just about every childhood book that you can think of that focuses on Black characters, or that were written by Black authors. And so that's a great place to start, just to help kids reinforce their sense of selves, and also diversifying their exposures.
Awesome, thank you. any other questions that we can find? Let me just check the Facebook feed and see if there's anything there. Anything here? Well, I'll make sure that people, if they have questions after when they watch, that we can get in touch with you, and they, you know, we can make it part of the Facebook feed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Well, thank you for having me. This was awesome. I'm looking forward to the rest of the day.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you back too. I'm sure as things develop and change and people's mental health needs are different in like a month, it would be great to talk more.
Yeah, no, yeah, the mental health aspect will definitely, it's going to linger, but it's coming for sure.
Definitely. Cool. Thanks, Nicole.
All right, well, thank you.